So hi all, my name is Zoe. As Darren just said, I do a lot of consulting work. I operate in the disability sphere, the disability justice sphere a lot. I'll talk about this a little bit in a minute, but I'm in health and medicine spaces a lot. I have my master's of public health, but I'm also almost done with medical school. So I'll be a doctor in 8 short months and I cannot wait to get there. Today, as I talk, I'm going to implement some accessibility practices that may feel totally new to you, or perhaps you're in these spaces all the time, and they're going to feel completely familiar to you. And the first one I'm going to use is an audio description of myself. It's intended as a speaker to let folks know who's talking to them if they're not able to see the person because perhaps they're blind, perhaps they're low vision, perhaps they have a migraine and they have their screen off, perhaps they have had a long day and they're lying down, whatever the context may be. And so I am a white-skinned person. I have dark brown hair that goes just below my shoulders. I'm wearing an orangish, peachish colored shirt today that's short sleeve. I have clear rimmed glasses and my background is blurred. The other practice you'll see me use is describing anything that's on my slides. This is for the exact same reasons I just said. And so on this slide, we have disability and Christianity, my name, MPH and MS4, which just means fourth year medical student, my pronouns, which are she and they, Queer Christian Fellowship, and an animated image of 2 disabled people, one light-skinned feminine person who has 2 amputated legs and prosthetics, one dark-skinned male-presenting person who has their left leg is amputated and they're using crutches. So a little bit about me. On this slide, there is a drawn animated image of me standing, smiling, holding my cane. So I am disabled. I became disabled when I was 11, which was an interesting experience because I had had 11 full years of not necessarily identifying as disabled. Someone just asked if we have captions. I'm going to let Darren or someone jump in for that, but hopefully the answer is yes. I'm just pausing so that if the person needs captions, they're not missing any information. Okay. Darren, I'm going to keep going. If someone is not able to access this without captions, I'm happy to work with one of my colleagues to get it transcribed afterwards or talk with you about how to do that too, to make sure it's accessible. So a little bit of context about my disability is sometimes it's visible. Sometimes I use a cane or a wheelchair, but sometimes it's invisible. So that's a really important part of the context of how I come at this is I understand ableism when I am visibly disabled and people are treating me maybe a little bit differently, but I also understand what ableism can feel like when the world is assuming that I'm a non-disabled person. I am queer. I identify as bisexual specifically. I am white. I operate in public health, medicine, and disability consulting spaces. And I am Christian. I put a question mark after this just because I think that Christian isn't necessarily a label that feels perfectly right to me because of a lot of the harms that have been perpetuated by the church. But I do identify as a person of faith. I am continually exploring my relationship with God, and my faith in Christian communities are really important to me. So it's not that I don't want to claim that word. I'm just figuring out exactly how I want to relate to and explain that word, knowing all of the context behind Christianity. So I always start with this quote anytime I'm talking about disability, and I have for years because it still to me feels like the most profound quote about why I do this work. And it's written by a friend of mine, Lydia X. Brown, who is a queer, genderqueer, autistic person who does phenomenal work. I highly recommend you look up their work. But they say few outside the disability community ever consider the consequences of their perceptions and limited understanding of disability. And many whose views are shaped by unsound and dangerous ideas continue to perpetuate ableism without ever having their privilege challenged and examined. This is from their writing in Disability in an Ableist World. And I like this quote because it reminds us that if we're not actively thinking about how we are perceiving or understanding a topic, we may be perpetuating harmful ideas and not even know it. Our intentions may be the most beautiful, sound, well-intentioned things, but if we're not actively considering the impact, then we've likely still got some room for growth. On this slide, it's simply Lydia's quote, and there are decorative orange and blue and gray shapes in the corner. On this slide, we've got an animated person using a sighted cane wearing glasses. They appear feminine and they have medium skin. It's not quite light, but it's not as dark. The slide says defining disability. And I like to start here because I think that when we think disability, we often are like, yeah, of course I know what that means. Of course I understand what disability means. But I have been doing this work long enough to kind of know that people's understanding of disability can sometimes be really limited. And a lot of that's shaped by how our society, our media, our books, our TV shows, et cetera, kind of frame disability. So I like to take a step back and offer two definitions. The first, as written on the slide, is impairment. Impairment means a limitation within the mind or body of the individual that causes that mind or body to function differently. Disability, however, is the loss or limitation of opportunities to take part in the aspects of every day due to social, physical, and/or environmental barriers. And so the key thing, as written on this slide, is disability is socially constructed as others disable those with impairments. And that can feel very like nitty gritty, like what is actually the difference? And so to use an example of my own body, an impairment that I experience is that my hips don't work quite right. They don't work very well. And so doing stairs is really hard for me. That's an impairment. That's something that is different. It's a limitation that my mind or body has. That only impacts my life, though. It only becomes disabling if there are stairs and no alternative. If there's an elevator or a ramp that's not too steep or another way to access something, that impairment, that difference in the way that my hips function, isn't necessarily disabling. And the reason that it's so important to kind of parse those two things out is because disability, as we know about race and gender and so many other social justice topics, truly is socially constructed. Not only are our beliefs and perceptions of disability constructed by the world around us, but literally the choices about how we engage with creating infrastructure, creating programming, sharing information, all of that influences whether or not someone's impairment becomes disabling. Now, that's not to say that our goal is to fix everything and therefore get rid of disability. Because of all of this lack of accessibility and other issues that we'll talk about a little bit more, disability has become a deep source of pride and community. It's something that represents a unique culture and a form of resilience. And so it's not that we want to fix everything to erase disability. We want to fix everything that now that we have such a deep disability community, we are all able to engage in all the same things. We no longer have these limitations in social, physical, or environmental barriers. And so to summarize some of that, disability is, and this is written on the slide, sometimes apparent and sometimes not. You have no idea if the person you're talking to is disabled, unless they share with you that they are or not. It's not just one experience. Not only are there so many types of disabilities, everything from blindness and deafness to folks who use wheelchairs or crutches or other mobility aids, folks who have ADHD, autism, other intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities. We have chronic illnesses, chronic pain, like the list is extensive. But it's also not just one experience in the same sense that someone with my exact same diagnosis will not have the same experience that I do. It's informed by so many of the other ways we operate within the world, ways that I might hold privilege or I might not hold privilege compared to them, resources we've had access to, and so much more. It's intersectional, as I just hinted at. One's experience of disability is informed by the color of their skin, their sexual orientation, gender identity, their socioeconomic status and what resources and tools they may have access to. I'm in the process of getting a new wheelchair right now, and it is month 7 of me trying to get it covered by insurance. So just speaking to that part of that. But disability is intersectional in the way that all of these other diversity and inclusion topics that we talk about is. It's not a bad word. Disability is not something to be ashamed of. It is powerful and beautiful and shapes my world in such a way to be celebrated. And so say the word. That's actually a hashtag campaign on social media, hashtag say the word. But say the word. Please don't use things like handy-capable or differently abled. Disability is not a bad word. We can just say it and own it and love it. When we try to use other words, other euphemisms, what we're really doing is saying there's some form of shame in being disabled. And so I'm going to try to make it sound a little bit better, a little bit less bad. It's also a culture. Disability culture is a very real thing. We are in Disability Pride Month right now as we speak. There are Disability Pride parades happening across the country. And we have so many components of this culture in the way that we understand a lot of other cultures, right? There are unique dance troupes and ways to dance and move your body in disability culture. There is Crip Hop, the movement started by Leroy Moore that combines the culture of hip hop and disability to use rap and hip hop dance as a way to comment on the disabled experience, particularly of Black men in America. There are disabled artists, TV shows made for and by disabled people. There's even language and phrases like Crip Time or spoons or all these things that I encourage you to look up if you're not familiar with, that are really a shared language within disability culture. And so I share all of that just to say that disability is unifying, but it's not universal. Our community is close-knit, and I cannot tell you the ways that being a part of it has transformed my life, but our experiences certainly aren't the same. Just a couple of things to note. This slide says of note, and it has a person wearing a hijab who has vitiligo or lightened spots on their skin. And then there is a person with long hair that has a left arm amputation that is sort of posing with their arms up on their head. And the slide reminds us that disability is diverse and it encompasses so many people. So over 25% of Americans are disabled. I would argue that that's probably a gross underrepresentation. I have so many patients that I talk with, and as I hear their stories and their experiences, I'm picking up on ways they're experiencing disability, but they may not necessarily identify as disabled. Maybe they don't know that they can, or maybe they know that there's a lot of stigma against disability, so they haven't claimed that yet. But I'm also thinking about how I became disabled as the result of a house fire when I was 11, but it wasn't until I was 20 years old. I'm 27 now. It wasn't until I was 20 years old that someone told me, hey, all of these experiences of chronic pain and fatigue and limited mobility that you have, like, this is your word too. Like, this is your community too. So I would argue there's probably more people than 25% of Americans, just not everyone might not report having a disability. Disability is present in every other identity group. There are people of all races, religions, sexual orientations, etc., that experience disability. And as we discussed, these intersections matter. And then I always like to note that disability has been classified in a variety of models. So my hope is that today is very much like a kind of Disability 101 overview and a launch pad into ways you could learn more, things you could look up. And I'm going to note some resources for that later too. But I like to note this because when you are exploring the world of disability or living it, it's important to be mindful of how is the information being framed. And it's likely being framed in one of the models of disability. There's medical, social, cultural, theological, and the list goes on, honestly, but those are the 4 main ones. And they all frame disability a little differently. Medical frames it as a problem as a pathology and illness to be fixed. Social frames it as a social issue, like we talked about. The issue isn't really the body, it's the fact that the space isn't accessible. Cultural, I'm actually in the process of learning more about, but it is really a model that frames disability as a culture, but it is not necessarily, it has some cons too. That sounds like a very beautiful thing, the way I just said it, but it's a little more nuanced than that. And I'm happy to share resources that I'm learning from about that. And then theological, which is what we're going to talk about on the last slide. So stay tuned for that one. But just be mindful that there are models and we have to kind of familiarize ourselves with them so we can ask ourselves, is this information being framed from a more harmful medical model, a more pathology standpoint, or a more nuanced understanding, preferably an understanding that has been led by people with disabilities ourselves? So defining ableism, I always like to just define ableism because I think that in the world of disability or the world of diversity and inclusion initiatives, disability is so often forgotten that sometimes I will list ableism as, something that is wrong with our worlds. And people will actually ask me, what is that? What does that mean? That's how far disability is on the back burner. And so ableism, I think we can kind of extrapolate and figure out a little bit of what it means given the context of the fact that we're talking about disability. But similar to racism, sexism, homophobia is not really an ism in the same way, but capturing the same principle is a harmful way of approaching an identity group. Ableism is very similar. And I like this definition in particular. It says ableism is a form of discrimination or prejudice against individuals with physical, mental, or developmental disabilities that is characterized by the belief that these individuals need to be fixed or cannot function as full members of society. And so ableism, particularly in the context of the United States, is centered around, a lot of it is centered around productivity. This idea that if you cannot produce and produce in the same ways that other people can, if your body cannot go for as many hours or work a classic 9 to 5, or produce the same type of intelligence or language, or have the same exact ways of communicating or relating to others, all of that takes your worth a notch lower. And then, as we mentioned, the intersections matter, right? So if you already have folks viewing you and your mind and body in a negative light because you have Black or brown skin, for example, and you combine that with all of this conversations around normal bodies and functioning and productivity with disability, if you are both Black and disabled, then that matters. That intersection influences the way people may be relating to you and viewing you. And so ableism is really the crux of what are we trying to push back on when we're having these conversations. On this slide, on the left side, there is a male presenting and a female presenting person communicating in sign language. Okay, so I'm jumping around a little bit and I recognize that, but I really, like I said, want this to be a Disability 101 conversation. What are topics and ideas and concepts that you should be familiar with if you're looking to learn more or apply it to your work, particularly in faith spaces? And so jumping a little bit to one of the ways we combat ableism, which is creating accessibility. On this slide, there's a giant blue circle that says accessibility, and within it is a tiny little gray circle that says accommodations. There is a person with long hair and an oversized sweatshirt that I'm kind of proud of this slide. I thought it was cute. Seems to be writing with chalk in the blue circle. It's made to look as though they are writing the word accessibility on the slide. And so accessibility and accommodations are two words we hear all the time in disability spaces, and they are related, but they are not the same. And I think it's so important that we name that because our goal is accessibility. I like to define accessibility as the creation of a space or a place where all bodies and minds can participate, lead, and thrive. And so accommodations play a role in creating that space. But ideally, if a space is accessible, accommodations won't ever be needed. An accommodation is typically a change made for one person. It's not a broad implemented way of creating accessibility. So I think a really kind of important example of this is whenever we think about academic accommodations, which is where this word often kind of comes into play. With academic accommodations, for example, I have an accommodation where I get a quiet space to take my tests. And so that is something that is done for just me. I'm the only one who gets that. Well, a couple other people get the same accommodation, but it's a change that is made on an individual basis. Whereas everyone else is kind of in this cramped, not super quiet room. And I have had many of my friends who take their medical school exams in that room tell me how it's really hard to focus and to fit and to feel comfortable in that room. And so what accessibility would look like is that room is constructed in a way where all bodies and minds, disabled and non, could participate, lead, and thrive. And so when we have a space where, if we think about a conference, for example, if we have a space where captions are already implemented always, there is an ASL interpreter, there is every bathroom is accessible, or if it's not, there's very clear signage for where the accessible bathrooms are. There are spaces for minds and bodies to rest. If all of these kinds of things are implemented, what that prevents is an individual who has a particular need from having to do the labor and take the time and the energy to reach out to the coordinators or fill out a form or whatever and say, these are the particular things that my mind and body needs. Now, the one caveat to this that I would say is there's so many types of disability and so many needs, it is almost impossible to predict all of them ever. And so I don't know if we will ever get to the goal of 100% accessibility at all spaces always. We have to create space for accommodations to also be okay to request and to receive. But right now, almost every space I'm in operates on there will be essentially no accessibility. We will only respond to accommodations. So that's kind of the difference there and how they relate to each other. The big takeaway in terms of accessibility, though, is we have to go beyond ramp mentality. So this slide has a stick figure wheelchair user pushing themselves up a ramp with an arrow pointing in the direction of up. There are, again, decorative kind of dots and lines and blobs in the left-hand corner, and it says the words, we have to go beyond ramp mentality into various types of accessibility, which are on this slide. So when we're thinking about creating accessible spaces, I want to name first, it's hard and it's not optional. I always have people who tell me, this is a lot of work. This requires a lot of thought. This requires a lot of money. And they're not wrong. And I think it's important that we name that that's not wrong. And it's not optional, because in no justice-oriented space, in no space that actually cares about people, in no space that is trying to resemble the kingdom of God, will we ever, can we ever be okay with leaving people out, with using money or time or energy as a justification for leaving people out? But to ignore that all of those things are true means that we are not confronting and supporting each other through the realities of creating accessibility. And so that is why I always tell people, having multiple folks working on this, having multiple people giving input, seeking resources and grants and opportunities if accessibility is creating a financial barrier, using consultants who have sliding scales that can work with your organization, making sure that if they are disabled, they are compensated, but also they're often willing to work with you. Finding all these different ways to make it happen is important. And there's lots of people who have done it, so you can turn to them. So types of accessibility: physical, there are ramps, that does matter. There's lighting. So sometimes having really bright fluorescent lighting can be a trigger for folks, but also having enough lighting so that folks with who are low vision or use some form of tool that they need to be able to see can do so. Having doors that people can open on their own and they don't have to constantly wait on someone else to be present to open them for them. Having toilets that are accessible and sinks that are accessible. There's sensory, so having braille options, sign interpreters, quiet spaces for people to kind of unload if they're experiencing sensory overload. Some things not written on this slide, but that I would also include: is having large print items, having scent-free policies. That one often gets forgotten, but so many disabled people have chemical sensitivities. And so having just a reminder to folks that they should like not spray, all their cologne on before they come to your conference, and having some scent-free soap options can be incredibly helpful. Intellectual accessibility, so using plain language. If you're not familiar with that, it's a particular type of writing or speaking that can be more accessible for autistic folks or other folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It is quite literally what it sounds like, in that it is plain language. So not relying on a lot of like sarcasm or things like that, sure, but also just using simple vocabulary, because that's also effective at making a point rather than having to use really complex vernacular. Having breaks for people's bodies and their brains, and having various ways to explain things, offering, a sentence and then immediately kind of saying it in another way, or offering a word and then explaining what that word might mean, or offering a synonym. Cultural and relational, we'll talk about language in a moment, but really unlearning all the crap that people have taught us about disability so that we're able to relate to each other from an informed standpoint, a standpoint that is not rooted in misbeliefs or myths about disability. And there's so much more. I had to kind of do a plug here, but I have a really comprehensive guide to how to make a space accessible. And so if anyone needs that for any of their work, I offer it on a sliding scale, and I'm happy to share it with you. A note on language, though. So this slide has a blue box that says person first and a red box that says identity first, as well as the phrase and other words that matter. So I often tell people that language is a key part of accessibility. And sometimes folks assume that I mean plain language, which I do, but I think it goes a bit deeper than that. So a lot of folks actually correct me when I say that I'm disabled. And they'll say, oh, but wait, you're a person with a disability. And they're not wrong. Like that is fundamentally true. I am indeed a person, and I do indeed have a disability. But to me, that assumption of person first language is rooted in a bit of a harmful idea. And so I want to say from the get-go that neither one is wrong, and everyone has a personal preference. And that is the right answer, is respecting someone's preference and the way that they are relating to their own disability. For me, though, identity first language, which means disabled person rather than person with a disability, is really key, because I do not see a separation. My humanness, my personhood is informed by and shaped by my disability. Every ounce of who I am and how I relate to my world, my space, my partner, my friends, my cats, whoever, is informed by me being disabled. And so in the same way that I don't casually say I'm a person with queerness, I'm a disabled person, I'm a queer person, I'm a white person, like all of these things inform and shape my worldview and also the world's experience of me. But person first language, person with a disability, was intentionally created by the intellectually and developmentally disabled community, particularly people with Down syndrome, who so often had the world forget their personhood and really boil them down only to a diagnosis, forget that they were a whole person with thoughts, beliefs, opinions, goals, relationships, people who could have fun and have friends and fall in love, people who could have jobs, like all of these pieces of them were often forgotten. And so they created that for a very particular reason, and it's very frequently still used by that community. And that's one of the moments where you kind of see the way that different parts of the disability community can have very, very different experiences and opinions on things. And it's our job to support each other, to confront our own ableism and figure out, how can I know how I feel about identity first language and still love and respect and support my fellow community members who don't feel that way about it? So all that to say, don't correct someone, just be aware that people may use either or, and it's inappropriate to tell a disabled person what their own preference should be and what their own relationship to disability should be. And other words that matter part of the slide is to say, I have a talk on ableist language that is over an hour itself. So that is not what we're going to get into today. But I will say a lot of our common everyday words can be really harmful towards disabled folks. And so there are so many lists out there of ableist words and what you can replace them with. My personal favorite is actually the one written by Lydia X. Brown, who I quoted on the first slide. But a quick Google search will tell you so many options for how to learn about this. But some words include crazy, which can be really harmful to folks with psychiatric disabilities. I find there are often much more descriptive ways to say what you want to say when you use that word. So if I say like, that experience was really crazy, I can often say like, that experience was really overwhelming, or that experience was really frightening, or that experience was really not what I expected, or whatever, language like lame and stupid and idiot. These are all words that are really rooted in harmful movements against disabled people. And we don't know that because we don't explore that history this often. In the same way that there was recently a controversy around a word that Lizzo used in her song. She said blatantly, I didn't know. And I think that that is so common, right? Is people don't know because we don't talk about disability. And so my recommendation for when folks kind of slip up and learn about an ableist word is to do exactly what she did and to say, I didn't know, but now I do. And then she changed it. So tell yourself, what are these words? Learn them, kind of read about them, and then don't expect to cut them out tomorrow. It is hard. I've been doing this work for about 7 years-ish, and it is still something that I'm working on. So learn, replace, correct, but know that it's not going to happen overnight. Okay. This is one of the last things I wanted to say before I give a quick note on Christianity, and then we take a break. The 10 principles of disability justice are written on this slide, and I'm going to read them in a moment. There's also 4 people on this slide, 1 in a wheelchair, 3 standing, 1 is smaller, appears to likely be a child, and 1 has an amputated leg, 2 are holding flags, and 3 have their fists in the air. I can't say for sure that this is true, but from my perspective, they look like they are protesting. They look like they are marching. And this slide, I really just, again, this would be a whole talk in and of itself, but I think I would be remiss to not name this movement. The disability justice movement was started in 2005 by Mia Mingus, Patricia Byrne, Eli Clare, Leroy Moore, but particularly Patty Byrne and Mia Mingus, 2 queer disabled women of color. And it was really the naming of a movement that had been happening for decades, particularly among disabled people of color, because they recognized that the disability rights movement was important, powerful, it mattered, and it wasn't enough. The disability rights movement that passed the Americans with Disabilities Act relies on legislation to promote disabled people's access to particularly public spaces, but it relies on the ability to sue, to use litigation. And what that does is it prioritizes white physically disabled people, because for people who are neurodivergent or process information differently, the process of suing a space for being inaccessible is inherently inaccessible. For Black, Brown, or poor folks who couldn't necessarily feel safe or afford to have a representative to sue a space that was not accessible to them, or to file an ADA complaint, this wasn't working. Not to mention, it's a lot easier to explain to a courtroom like they didn't have a ramp, therefore I couldn't go, rather than they didn't have a space that worked for my sensory needs, or the other more nuanced types of disabilities that we don't have a good understanding of accessibility around. So basically, it mattered. I'm grateful for it, and it was not doing the job. It wasn't actually creating room for all people to exist. And so the disability justice movement has 10 principles, including intersectionality, leadership of the most impacted, an anti-capitalist politic, a commitment to cross-movement organizing, recognizing wholeness, sustainability, commitment to cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. Sins Invalid, which is the group founded by Patty Byrne, has a PDF primer available for free online to learn more about this. But I wanted to just say that we have to go deeper and we have to be more intentional. We have to be truly centered on these 10 principles to combat the ableism we currently have in the world. So in the church, this is my last slide, and I'm only going to talk about the church for a moment because my hope is that our discussion time can be all of us piecing together, what does this mean for the church, for Christianity? Sorry, I was catching up on the chat. So this is something that I don't have all the answers to, right? Even though faith spaces is one of the areas I work with the most often by far, I still think that it is hard for me to imagine how do we truly uproot how deeply ableism is entrenched in these spaces. And so I want to name just a few things on this slide, give us a break, and then come together to talk a little bit more about, first of all, what questions popped up during all of this, but also like, how do we use all this as people of faith? How do we move forward? And so the first thing I want to say is if your church is not accessible, you are sending a message. I had this church that I joined when I came to Chicago. Darren's heard this story a few times, but I fell in love with it and the people there because I could be queer. I could be as queer as I wanted to be. I could be as publicly out. Also, like my partner and I are of opposite genders, but my queerness never felt erased because of that in that space. So I could like truly be bisexual and everyone loved me and supported me and celebrated me as a queer person. But that church was so inaccessible. Y'all, like if I wanted to go inside and was using my wheelchair, I had to go through an alley past 3 dumpsters and into a slightly broken door. Like that is enough of a message. But then when we think about the fact that like communion wasn't accessible when I first got there, so many worship songs and sermons were mentioning like healing of the blind and all this stuff. It wasn't actually supporting me as a whole person who deserves access to a faith community and deserves a space to form a relationship with God, and to process a lot of the trauma around being like growing up queer in faith spaces. So all that saying, we see you, we experience you when you don't create accessible spaces in your church. But beyond that, the theological model of disability is the first line that's written in these 3 lines. It says, disability is inherently a punishment for a severe sin. So I have folks often kind of bring up, and I am not a biblical scholar, y'all, so I'm sure someone here can tell me the exact quote. But the moment in the Bible where the question is asked if disability is a punishment for the mother's sin or the child's sin. And that is the theological model. That is what so many churches were founded on, is this idea that disability is a punishment for a wrongdoing. The second idea that churches often bring up is that disability is virtuous suffering. So it is a challenge given to a person by God because God knows that we are strong enough. God knows that we can persevere and we can set an example to others. Essentially, we can be an inspiration. And then finally, disability is a test of patience and trust in God. So in time, cure and or healing will arrive. I want to tell a story that I hadn't planned to tell because it hadn't happened yet when I made this PowerPoint. But last night, I went to Summerfest in Milwaukee with a group of friends of mine, and I was using my wheelchair. And a gentleman came up to me and first of all, put his hand on my shoulder without consent. And I will tell you, as someone who part-time uses a wheelchair, that happens almost daily when I use my wheelchair. Like this assumption that I'm like a child or somehow become like public property. So that's a whole thing in and of itself. But he put his hand on my shoulder and he looked at me and he said, have you ever heard of something? I couldn't hear what he said. And so I said, sorry, I can't really hear you. And I tried to wheel away and he said it again. I still don't know what exactly he said, but he went on to offer an explanation that I heard very clearly. He said, it's a show on TV and it captures the way that God heals. And I watched it and knew that it must be true. And so now I have sought healing and now I am better. And he gestured to his legs. I don't know what had been going on with his legs, but he gestured to his legs in a way to demonstrate that something about them had been not the way that they were now. And I looked at this man and I said, I'm actually not looking for healing, not for my disability, at least. I like being disabled. I like being who I am. And I wheeled away. And I think that that is the best commentary I could have possibly been given for this last point, that God will heal. I'm looking for healing for some things. Sure. There are certainly things in my life that have happened that I am in search of processing and gaining more control over my understanding of, in the same way that I think most humans are. But I'm not looking for healing for my disability, because fundamentally I would not be Zoie without it. Fundamentally, everything about who I am, what I have done, what my goals are, and what I have accomplished would be gone if it weren't for disability. And then finally, the last point I'll make is I don't want to be healed because being disabled is just fun. Being a part of a community that is this creative and this resilient and this focused on supporting one another, it is at a foundational level fun. So I don't want it to go away. Healing is not in my interest. And it's my hope that as Christians or as people of faith, we can center that experience and those stories rather than a desire for healing or overcoming. Yeah, that's all I have to share.